Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another YouTube special and another Grandmaster Plays a Beginner video. So, a couple of months ago, on a whim, I decided to record a video where I basically played a longer chess game, a 15-minute chess game, against a player in the rough sort of beginner range. And I sort of, in great detail, explained all of my moves. And again, I did it on a whim, but it really has taken off, and the feedback has been amazing, and I really appreciate that. And as a response, I decided to make another one of these videos where I basically play a player in the beginner/intermediate rating range on chess.com, and I will walk through all of my moves and all of my thinking processes, and hopefully, if I win the game, I'll talk about exactly the elements required and the elements that led me to ultimate victory. So without further ado, I'm going to seek a game on chess.com, a rapid game, and we're going to wait for an opponent. This sometimes takes quite a while. And in the meantime, just wanted to sort of outline very quickly the rationale behind, well, I won't outline anything because the game is underway and I have the white pieces. And I like to customarily start with a move e4. Okay, so here we see something called the modern defense, which to a lot of you, I'm sure, is probably unfamiliar. Black plays the move g6. Now, this is rather uncommon. Normally, Black plays e5, or he plays the Sicilian with c5. Now, the immediate drawback of the move g6, right, is that Black does not occupy the center. And Black does not make even a claim at the center. So I will take this opportunity to occupy the center with my own pawns. Now, am I implying that the move g6 is bad? No, it's actually not. In fact, I often play this move myself with the black pieces. What Black is doing is called fianchettoing the bishop. That's an Italian term, which simply means bringing the bishop to the longest diagonal on the chessboard. You can fianchetto on the other side of the board as well. The drawback of this, of course, is that, as I said, Black doesn't occupy the center. He lets me occupy the center with my pawns, and now I'm going to bring out my pieces in order to keep these pawns nicely protected. So what is the point of this fianchetto? What is the point of the modern? If Black plays this correctly, then he's going to use essentially his pieces to try to apply pressure on my center. This is a hypermodern opening. And hypermodern openings were sort of developed in the 1920s as part of a shift in chess thinking where people started realizing that controlling the center with pawns, while important, isn't the only thing that matters. And a lot of openings can survive the test of time by giving your opponent control of the center, which would have been unthinkable years ago, let's say 150 years ago. So you give your opponent control of the center, and then you attack that center from a distance with some of your pieces. So the way that I want to develop my pieces here is with an eye toward protecting the central pawns. In particular, let's take a look at this bishop on c1. Where should I put it? Well, I'm going to put it on e3. Because I want to give some reinforcement to this pawn on d4 so that if he brings his knight out to c6, he's not going to be attacking it. Okay, so he goes c6. And in general, I'm a big proponent of always asking what your opponent wants. That's a question which sort of has to circulate in your mind basically all of the time. I mean, anytime you're in an unfamiliar position. And this move c6, what could the intention be? Well, first of all, maybe he wants to bring his queen out, but it's pretty early. That's not a dangerous idea. What is more annoying is queenside expansion with b5. I don't want to let him occupy space on the queenside and potentially bring his pawn to b4. So how can I prevent this? Well, to the rescue comes my corner pawn. I'm going to push it up to a4. And now the move b5 would end up blundering a pawn. I would simply take it with my pawn. He would take it with his. And I would take it either with my bishop or with my knight. So he ends up developing his knight. Now I'm going to make a very important move. Now, those of you who are familiar with this type of position generally know that White tries to castle queenside in such a position and attack Black's king if Black castles kingside. This is called opposite side castling, and it's a situation in which both sides try to attack the opposing king on their side of the board. And if we anticipate that Black is going to castle, what are going to be the elements of the attack? And I'll talk about this a little bit later. I mean, hopefully he does castle, but let's first take care of the immediate business, and that is that this knight has the annoying possibility of jumping to g4 and dislodging my bishop from e3. So I don't want that to happen. But I can prevent it with h3, but I want to prevent it in a way that also gives a little bit more reinforcement to my center. So I'm going to play the move f3. And after the game, I will talk a little bit more about why I am playing f3 when it seems to be a violation of some key chess principles, right? I'm taking away that square from the knight. And in general, the move f3 is known as quite a weakening move. So our opponent has indeed castled. And he continues to play fast. So what are the elements of the attack against Black's king? Well, there's going to be two things that I want to bring to everyone's attention. The first is this bishop on g7. Eventually, this bishop will probably have to get traded if I am to reach the Black king. How is this bishop going to get traded? Well, there is one very typical method that allows us to trade that bishop, and that is to put the queen on d2, which I'm going to do right now, and then to bring the bishop over to h6. So why does that force the bishop trade? Because there's nothing Black can do about it. If he drops his bishop back, that's going to drop the exchange. That's going to drop the rook. Not desirable at all. And otherwise, I'm either going to take the bishop or he's going to take mine. And then the queen is going to take the place of my bishop and actually serve as a very important attacker. So this is an important situation for my opponent to respond accurately. And if I were playing Black here, I would try to distract White's attention, so my attention, by striking in the center. And as I say that, he does exactly that. So the tempting move for us here would be bishop h6. But let's think that through for a second. If we go bishop h6, he takes our bishop. We take his bishop with our queen. And if you look carefully at this pawn on d4, which I've just highlighted in blue, that pawn is lost. We lose a central pawn. Not desirable. Next question we ask ourselves, can we reinforce the pawn on d4? Can we maybe bring a piece out and maybe take that pawn under further control to prepare bishop h6? Well, we absolutely can, right? We can develop our knight to e2. Now, is this the optimal development square for the knight? Not necessarily. I'm blocking off my bishop. I realize that. But chess is all about priorities, right? And the expression that I always like to repeat is you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. And that's very true in chess. I actually hate omelets, but more about that later. But the thing is, our priority here is to attack Black's king, right? That is our absolute top on the list. And in order to do that, we're going to have to make some figurative and perhaps even literal sacrifices, such as suboptimal development for some of our other pieces. Now, he ends up taking the pawn. We're going to take that with our knight, which allows us now to centralize our knight, which is a good thing. But our opponent is actually playing some sensible moves here. And if I were him, I would continue to operate in the center by playing d5, continuing to distract my attention from basically the plan of trading bishops and attacking the king side. So we'll see what Black does here. Now, the move a4 that I played, okay, he does play d5. Very interesting. Now, what do we do? So the first inclination would be to take on d5, right? But that would not be a good idea. By opening up the center, we expose our king. And if we expose our king, then the move f3, I'll start regretting that move because he might plan to rook on e8. I don't want to do that. I want to keep the center closed. What does it mean to keep the center closed? Well, often when we want to do that, what we really want to do is push a pawn up one square and freeze the center as much as possible. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go e5 here. Now again, my opponent is certainly playing very, very well in the opening, but that's part of what chess is, right? Sometimes you're going to get someone who is on a roll, who plays some good moves, and you want to keep being disciplined. You want to keep sticking to your fundamental ideas, and you want to believe that stuff is going to actually work. So we have a small problem because he's attacking the pawn on e5. That doesn't seem to be a problem. We can protect it with our pawn. But if we protect it with our pawn, then he pushes his pawn up to c5, attacking our knight. We have to move the knight away from d4, and then he's going to push the other pawn to d4. And if you have a chessboard lying nearby, you can absolutely follow along on that board. But the upshot of that is that we're going to lose a piece. We're going to lose a minor piece to a fork. That's not good. So we need to find another way to defend this pawn. But it turns out if we look very carefully, we don't actually need to defend it. We can push it. We can push it up to e6. Because if he takes, what happens then? Well, we take with the knight. That is a fork on his queen and his rook. Very undesirable for Black. He's going to lose an exchange. So if he knows what he's doing, and so far we have every reason to believe that he does, he has to move his knight. He shouldn't take this pawn. he has to make us take his pawn on f7. But let's assume for a second that that happens. What is that going to lead to? It's actually going to be beneficial to us because we're going to eliminate one of the key pawns that form his defensive foundation on the king side. So if we're thinking about attacking, then, you know, that's going to be a pretty nice advance. That's going to be a pretty nice benefit for us that we've eliminated one of the pawns surrounding his king. So I'll put it this way. I think that black is doing great here, but it's the kind of position which is very, very hard to play unless you have a lot of experience. There's a lot of pitfalls and landmines that are very easy to step on if you haven't played these kinds of positions before. And when I say these kinds of positions, what I really mean are positions with opposite side castling, positions where the sides have castled to opposite sides and they're attacking each other's kings. There's a lot of tactics that is involved in such a situation. And probably many of you are here after watching Queen's Gambit, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And, you know, Beth Harmon would be very good at these types of positions. Opposite side castling, that's right up her alley. And it's actually right up my alley as well, because I have a very aggressive style. So I really enjoy these kinds of positions. Let's see what he ends up doing. He's definitely trying to mull all of these options over. And he's decided, should I take on e6? We can almost see the wheels turning in his brain. And the 15-minute chess is good because both sides have the time to really think through the ramifications of all the moves. Unlike bullet chess or blitz chess, which is 3 minutes per game, in 15-minute chess, you can really think stuff through. And he does. He plays knight e5, another very good move. All right, so what do? We kind of concluded already that we need to get rid of this pawn because it's currently being attacked by two pieces. So let's capture his pawn on f7. He's probably going to take with a rook, would be my assumption, keeping his own knight in the center. And once he takes with a rook, right, we have to pay attention to the fact that the center has been opened. When I say that, I mean really the e-file has been opened, and our king is on the e-file. I don't like that. Let's tuck our king away somewhere. Where can we tuck our king? Well, as we already know, we want to castle long. Now, I know some of you might be looking at this move and saying, whoa, what are you doing? Didn't you push your pawn out to a4? And now you're castling on the same side where you pushed a pawn out? Well, yes, I realize that may look weird. I know. But the reality is, again, and again, I always repeat this, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. Just because we have one pawn that's not on its initial square doesn't mean that he's going to checkmate us in two moves. Because for one thing, that pawn on a4 is protected. Okay, that pawn on a4 is protected. It's not going to be that easy to attack. Even if he brings his queen to a5, he's not threatening to take it. The other thing is that, even if worse comes to worse, he somehow finds a way to take the pawn. We can slide our king over to b1, and amazingly, even if we imagine that the pawn is gone, it's not like he's going to have immediate checkmating ideas either. So this is what I always advocate for if you're getting more experienced in chess and you're trying to make inroads and become a better player. One thing that often holds players back are these knee-jerk assumptions that people make about certain positions. You know, you look at a pawn like this and say, I can't castle long because the pawn is out on a4. But, you know, the more experience you get, the more you want to question those assumptions you initially make about certain positions. What that allows you to do is essentially formulate your own vision of the game, and you know, it allows you to know when you should violate basic principles and when you should abide by them, and there's a time for both. Okay, so our opponent is burning through his clock. He's now at 10 minutes and 30 seconds, still plenty of time for both of us. And while he's thinking, and there's a lot to think about here, let's talk a little bit about what my plan in this position is. I've already hinted at some of the elements of that plan, but now that we have eliminated his f-pawn, there's one idea in particular that is going to be quite a bit stronger than it would be with the f-pawn on the board. Okay, but red alert, let's interrupt that because he's gone c5, he's attacked the knight. And I'm sure that quite a few of you were wondering what I would do in this scenario, because I previously pointed this out and said that this would win a piece. But the situation has changed a little bit. A first order of business for us is to drop the knight back. It's being attacked. And we drop it back with tempo. We attack the pawn now with two different pieces. But it may seem that black plays the aforementioned move d4, which I pointed out, and he wins a piece, right? He forks the bishop and the knight. And again, this is precisely the kind of situation where you want to look past the superficial indicators of the position. Now, what you want to see is the fact that when he plays d4, he isn't actually threatening to take either of these pieces. Because look at the queen on d8. It's actually being x-rayed by our queen and by the rook. Not that that matters. So he cannot afford to give up the queen. And so after d4, we are going to have a very important tempo that we are going to have to use to somehow get ourselves out of the fork. Because if we don't, then he's going to move his queen away. And, well, then he actually is going to be giving us a fork. Okay, so I hope this is making sense. I can guarantee you that our opponent is mulling over the options here. He's definitely considering d4. But if he doesn't play d4, then we're going to take that pawn on d5. And when we do, that d file, which opens up, is going to be very problematic for him. Because I want you to look at one and notice one very important thing. In all of the stuff that's happened, we have actually gained a nice lead in development, because I have developed basically most of my pieces, and maybe other than the bishop, but the bishop can also be playing a tangential role. It can go to c4 at some positions. He, on the other hand, my opponent, is completely undeveloped on the queen side. 3 of the pieces are on initial squares, and it's going to be very hard to sustain for a long period of time a position with an open center where you haven't developed any of your pieces on one side of the board. So I'm pretty sure that our opponent is paying attention to that, and he's trying to find workarounds. He goes c4. It's actually a very interesting move. So what he's doing is he's attacking our knight, and this time he really is threatening to capture it. We have to move the knight. Where do we move it? Well, there's a couple of candidate options. I don't want to move it to a1. That's actually not such a bad idea, because it leaves the d5 pawn very weak. But let's put that on the back burner for now. So what I want to find ideally is a square that fulfills or checks 2 boxes. Keeps the knight active, number 1. And number 2, it doesn't obstruct our attack over the d5 pawn. So a move that would be very tempting is knight to d4, but knight to d4, as good as it looks, relinquishes our attack on the d5 pawn. So are there any other squares which, you know, are relatively active and also allow us to keep the pressure on this weak pawn on d5? Well, if you look around the queen side, you might find such a square, and that is the square c5, which is where we're going to put our knight. Obviously, this doesn't tell the whole story. He can chase the knight away with b6. But if you remember that the queen on d8 is pinned, or rather the pawn is pinned, we can actually put this knight on e4. We can put this knight on a square that is supposedly defended by the pawn, but we already know that this pawn on d5 cannot actually move. So it's a moot point. We can put the knight on e4, centralizing it, and then on the next move, we can eliminate the pawn on d5, eliminating the danger to that knight on e4. So I think that that's probably what's going to happen. My guess is he's going to play b6. Maybe he realizes that I have this knight e4 idea in mind, and he's trying to come up with something different, but it's a very interesting position. And this is exactly where we see the price that he pays for not developing his queenside, because had black had all of his pieces developed, knight on c6, bishop on f5, then it would have been a lot easier to deal with the attack that I'm orchestrating on that d5 pawn. As it stands, he doesn't have the resources necessary to protect against that. And I'm very curious to see how he's going to deal with that. So we're going to keep an eye on what he does. In the meantime, before he played c5, I was going to briefly mention what the kingside ideas are, which might be completely moot, because we're going to end up taking the pawn on d5 and playing in the center. But were we to play on the kingside, one way that we can often start an attack is by opening files. Files are like the currency of an attack. Without open files for our rooks and our queen, I was going to say our queens, but I'm assuming you haven't promoted multiple queens yet. Assuming you have only one queen, files are crucial for the rook and the queen. Oh, now I said the rooks as singular. Man, I'm a complete mess. Rooks and queen. How hard is it to say? Now, it is possible to conduct a complete attack without an open file, right? Just with the minor pieces, or maybe with the queen on a particular square. And then there's ways of doing that. But it's a lot easier when you do have an open file. By the way, he goes b6, so we're going to slide the knight to e4 as planned, and we're going to see what he does. And so in order to open up a file around black's king, a very typical technique in such positions is to push this pawn up to h5, and then capture the pawn on g6, thereby opening up the file for the rook on h1. Now, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that the bishop on g7 should often be traded off by putting our bishop on h6. So I'm asking you to do a lot of visualization here, which I know is quite challenging. And again, if you have a board lying around, you're welcome to sort of try to reproduce what I'm saying on a board. And I'll go over this after the game. But if you can imagine that the bishop on g7 is gone from the board, and the h-file is open, where can white put his queen? Well, white can put it on h6, where it will combine with a rook on h1 and threaten a bunch of checkmates, such as the one on h8. But our opponent has made a move. Let's switch back to the task at hand. Okay, so he's gone bishop e6, lending support to the pawn on d5. Can we take that pawn? Well, we can, right? We can take, he takes, and we're up a pawn in the endgame. Another way of counting this, we have 1, 2, 3 attackers on the pawn. He has 1, 2 defenders, and the rook does count as an attacker. I know this might be confusing to some people, but the rook is an attacker by X-ray, right? Because the queen is eventually going to move away, and then the rook is going to unfurl itself, and it's going to defend the queen. But it's very important to look for a better move rather than just slamming knight takes d5 onto the board. And there actually is a better move here. So what I'm seeing is the relationship between the bishop and the rook. The bishops and the rook are on a forkable spot. And when we have our knights centralized like this, we should always be looking for forks by default, because that's what centralized knights do. They control a lot of squares, and they can produce these kinds of forks. Now, this fork doesn't actually win his bishop or his rook. He can slide his rook over and protect his bishop at the same time. But what this trade is going to do is it's going to attenuate, it's going to weaken his control over the d5 square. And not only that, but once we take the pawn on d5, if my bishop ever comes out to c4, there will be hell to pay. Because he will no longer have a light-squared bishop to keep my bishop at bay. So I'm making an investment in my future here. I sound like I'm a retirement planner or something, but sometimes that's how you want to play chess, right? It's almost as if you're planning for retirement. You're planning for stuff that may happen later down the line, and you don't know exactly how it's going to happen or even whether it's going to happen. That's what makes chess such an amazing game, partially. And also what makes it so challenging and at times so infuriating is that not only do you have to monitor everything that's going on right now in the current position, but you also have to prognosticate and predict all of these ways that the game can potentially continue, and you have to prepare for them. And that skill is very, very difficult. Now, what I'm trying to show here is how I'm preparing for that future, where I'm thinking that eventually my bishop is going to come out to c4. Now, why do I think so? Because if you follow the line, he's probably going to do this, so you won't have to visualize for much longer. But after we take the bishop and he takes, and we take, well, that's not what we do. The pawn does not fly backward. We take on d5. If you notice the knight on e5, it is the only piece then that guards the pawn on c4. And the knight is very easy to dislodge. We can do that with the move f4, forcing the knight away, and then that's it. Our bishop can, I cannot draw arrows today. Our bishop comes out to c4, and we win the game very quickly. So already, his position is on the verge of collapse, even though it doesn't seem that way. It seems that everything is fine. Black's position is chugging along, but as evidenced by his time consumption, his position is on the verge of complete collapse here, particularly when we take this pawn on d5. I just don't see a way for him to coordinate his remaining pieces in time to prevent the future assault. So is there anything else that Black can do here? Well, he can... Okay, so he does go rook e7. We take his bishop. He's, I assume, going to take our knight, and we take on d5 with our knight. Now, very quickly, while he's thinking, could we have taken on d5 with our queen? What would have been the pros and cons of that? We could have. We absolutely could have taken it with the queen, and that would have forced a queen trade, because if you look at the queen on d5, it's attacking both rooks, so he's got to take it. And then we can take with the knight, and we have an amazing endgame, right? The queens have gone off the board, so it's an endgame. And by the way, not all positions with the queen gone are endgames, but I would qualify this as an endgame. So that would have been probably maybe even better. But I like playing with the queens on the board. I feel like it can be a little bit more instructive for certain players. And the other good thing about this, okay, he's got knight d3 check. So again, red alert, let's unpack this move. This looks imposing. It's actually not intimidating at all. What is he doing? Let's unpack this move. What he's doing is what I call an interception tactic. There's probably a better name for it. There's even probably a proper name for it. But you can see that he's intercepting my protection of this knight on d5. He's putting his knight against the queen and the rook, and he's forcing something to land on d3. And that something, whether it's a bishop or a pawn, it's not going to be a queen. I don't want to give away the queen. That something is going to preclude my defense of the knight on d5. He's going to be able to take it with his queen. So in effect, it's just a trade, right? It's just a trade of pieces and nothing more than that. But the reality is it doesn't actually help him. Because here's what I'm going to do. I don't want to take the knight with a pawn and ruin the protection of my king. I'm going to take with the bishop. And he can actually take the bishop too, which he does. But now we take with the queen, we reinforce our defense of the knight, and we win a second pawn. Now the negative of this is that we have gotten rid of our light squared bishop, and I had very big aspirations for this bishop. If you can remember, I was going to put it on c4, but that's exactly what I mentioned. You have to be very flexible in chess. Anything can happen, and you need to be ready for these eventualities, and you need to embrace them. And so we're 2 pawns up. We have beautiful control of the center. We have a knight on d5 that's just waiting to go on to greener pastures. There's a lot of tactics that surround this entire relationship here. And we'll see how our opponent tries to handle that. But what tactics am I immediately thinking of? Well, the first thing I think of is some sort of a discovered check. And a discovered check or discovered attack is when you move a piece away from a particular square, usually with check, and you expose behind that piece some sort of attack on a particular piece that's being exposed. That is probably going to make its way to whatever anti-Merriam-Webster's dictionary is called, if there's like an anti-dictionary. But basically, I think you get the point. If we move the knight away, then the queen behind the knight is attacking the queen on d8. Black has to attend to the check. And the logic is that in the time that he spends attending to the check, we will take his queen, and we are going to be up a queen. There's one flaw in that thinking. If we actually play knight f6 check, he can take that knight with his queen, simultaneously escaping the discovery. Okay, so we got to be very careful about that. I see this missed all the time. But in any case, he's gone queen c8. He has escaped whatever tension existed along that file. And once again, we have to find a good move here. Now, what kinds of things am I thinking about? Well, we're 2 pawns up. We have a great position. Let's not forget that our ultimate aim here is to attack black's king. Let's not forget our second ultimate aim, to attack the king. We have to get rid of the bishop. The bishop is the gatekeeper here on the king side. And if we can get rid of it, it opens up the possibility for all of these various checks. Now, we cannot go bishop h6 anymore because our queen is no longer on d2. But what we can do is we can go bishop to d4, right? Contesting the bishop. So even if the bishops don't end up getting traded, it's a great idea to interpose this bishop on g7, because right now it's black's strongest piece. It's the only piece that's really doing anything at all. And without that piece, black has nothing else developed. His king is just going to get massacred with our knight and our queen and potentially even a rook that can come into the game. I could have done that, by the way, as well. When in doubt, identify pieces that aren't doing anything and bring them into the game. That's a great strategy for when you're not sure what to do. We could have just brought this rook on h1 into the game. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, Daniel, didn't you say earlier that you wanted to open that h file? So could you have gone h4 here? Absolutely. It's a little bit slow, a little bit, right? It takes a bunch of moves to do that, but I could have absolutely done that as well. Okay, so he accedes to our demand to trade bishops. He's probably going to bring his knight out to c6, would be my guess. And that would be the correct move. I mean, he has to somehow develop his pieces. It's not going to help him because he's a little too far gone. He's down 2 pawns. His king is very weak, so maybe he'll try to prolong the game. And we need to keep all of our options open. One issue that I see... Okay, so we'll talk about issues later. Right now he's threatening checkmate. We always need to watch for that kind of stuff. How do we protect against checkmate without losing the momentum that we have built up on the king side? Well, there's a couple of options. All right? And I think the simplest option is to just get rid of this rook altogether. I just don't want to see it there. I'm just going to go rook to d2. I'm going to get out of e2. Either we go for a rook trade, which is certainly something I'm happy to entertain, or the rook has to move back away. That gives us time to basically fulfill the attack. Now, one very important thing. If he takes our rook, some of you might spot the fork on e7, forking his king and his queen. If we do that immediately after he takes on d2, that is a problem because he can go king f7. And then if we take his queen, remember that we still haven't captured the rook on d2, which can now take our queen, and at the end of the day, he's going to be up a rook. So these kinds of intermediate moves, you want to look for them, but you want to be very careful on making them because they can backfire. He's gone queen e6. Okay, so he's gone queen e6, which means that he has supported the rook with his queen. There's many ways to win this game from this position. His position is wide open, as you can see. But I always start by looking for ways to win material, right? If we can find a way to win a significant chunk of material, then we basically, we don't even really have to calculate then. We can take that material and the attack continues. So what kind of material gaining tactics can we be looking for here? First of all, forks. I mentioned that many times. In these positions with a knight as centralized as we have, we are looking for forks. Now there's two forks that you might see. One is knight f4. Not good because he can take our rook and simultaneously attack the queen. The other fork that is better is the move knight c7. Forking his queen and his rook. He's welcome to take our rook. We're just going to take back, and that's not going to do anything to disrupt the fork. There's a couple of lines that confound this and that some of you may be seeing right now, and you might be a little bit scared of them, like rook e1 check. You can give us a check with this rook. But if you follow along, we just take the rook, he takes with his queen, and then we slide our rook back, attacking the queen, and we are still attacking the rook with our knight. And that is why my relationship to the queen is a problematic one, and I think people really need to work on their understanding of how the queen works. Queens are incredibly powerful pieces, but at the same time, you want to be careful about what tasks you assign to the queen, because queens are also easy to attack. And when they are attacked, because they are the most powerful piece, they almost always have to move, and that can create actually a liability. So we'll talk about that after the game. But in the meantime, he's got knight c6. This move makes a lot of noise. It's actually a very creative move. He's counter-attacking our queen, but we're just going to take his queen. He's going to take our queen, and we're going to take his knight. And at the end of the day, we are going to be up another knight, and we're going to be up 2 pawns from our previous marriage. And I don't even know why I said that, but it sounded right. So we're going to be up a knight and 2 pawns, and the rest is going to be very easy. Now, I know that some of you probably are wondering, you know, how do I convert advantages in the endgame? Let's say I'm up a knight. I always miss wins in the endgame, and that is a source of problems for a lot of players. They get into endgames where they're up a lot of pieces or just one piece, and they don't know how to actually convert that advantage. So hopefully our opponent doesn't resign, so I can talk about it a little. Now, first of all, we need to protect this knight. So let's go c3 to establish it on d4. And fundamentally, well, there's 2 main ways of winning an endgame like this when we're up this much material. The simplest one is to create a passed pawn. A passed pawn is a pawn that is on a file where it is uncontested by any opposing pawns. If it simply goes forward, it will promote. Obviously, pieces might stop it, but a passed pawn refers only to the absence of obstructing pawns, not to obstructing pieces. That's method number 1. And in order to create a passed pawn, we have to identify where on the board we can create it. What I'm seeing here is that we have a pawn majority here. We have 3 pawns against our opponent's 2. And so what we can do is we can just try to create a passed pawn here, and that's going to tide us over pretty well. That passed pawn is going to be on the f file, and we're going to use our extra piece. We're going to use all of our pieces, which is very important in the endgame to keep all of your pieces active. We're going to use it to supervise that pawn and to guide it all the way to promotion. Very simple, and our opponent resigns. The position is completely losing, and the win is going to be very elementary. And that was a very interesting game, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's quickly go over it, summarize, and make a couple of important points before we wrap up. Now, our opponent played the modern. As I explained, this is an opening, and literally it's in the name, modern, right? It's an opening that was laughed at 150 years ago, because why would you allow your opponent control of the center? But that's kind of the point. Black establishes this sort of Maginot line. Black establishes this, I don't even know how to call it, right? He's fianchettoing the bishop. He's really looking at white center from a distance. And he's going to start attacking it with all of these pieces and pawns, and he's going to slowly bring his pieces into the center. So it's a tremendously risky way of playing. But if people play this well, the modern can also be one of the most dangerous weapons that white has to reckon with, because it creates a very unbalanced position. So what did I do? I developed my bishop to e3. I played the move a4 to stop him from advancing the pawn to b5 and claiming space on the queen side. Now a very important move, f3, defending the pawn on e4 and also stopping his knight from coming to g4. We go queen d2, as I explained. We are preparing the move bishop h6. So if he played some random move, we would have forced the bishop trade, and this is a big blow for black. By the way, If you want to know how to avoid this bishop trade, pro tip, you can play this move. Now, this looks dumb. Like, why are we putting the rook here? The point is that if we go bishop h6, the bishop can now slide back to h8. And remember, there used to be a rook on f8. Now there is but an empty square. So that is a very classical way of actually preserving the bishop. But our opponent found another way to do that. He played e5, striking in the center, so we defend the center. Now he strikes in the center again, and really the pivotal point was here. The move f4 would be tempting, but he attacks the knight, and then he forks our knight and our bishop. Compare this situation to the situation that occurred here. Here, and I'm going to flip back to the other situation, he had a knight on d7 here. There's no such thing here. He has a queen on d8, and that queen is all alone. And I think this is the detail that won me the game, because the move d4, while it seems to fork the knight and the bishop, actually does, and I have the time to take on c5, isolating this pawn on d4, and then I'm going to take it on the next move. So without that, our opponent tried to push c4, but we got our knight around to e4, exploiting once again the pin against the queen. Here, we could have easily grabbed the pawn on d5, but instead we said, okay, this bishop on e6 is like the glue guy. It's like the sixth man. If we eliminate that piece, his entire position collapses, and that is exactly what happened. He tried the move knight d3, very creative play by our opponent, intercepting our defense of the knight. But as it turned out, by the way, if he would have taken the knight instead, we would have simply gone bishop e4. Queen takes, queen is forced, and now we end up in a situation where he literally pays the ultimate price for not developing his queen side. His rook is trapped. I suppose he can go knight c6, but now his other rook is lost due to a skewer against his rook. So it's not a surprise that all of this stuff happens, because he's got so many holes in his position, and that's just what happens. You got to look for tactics when you sense that your opponent's position is on the verge of collapse, and ultimately we won a second pawn. Finally, we do succeed in trading our bishop, and we get the rook out of there, and now we find the fork to win a bunch of material and win the game. So just very quickly, if he goes rook e1 check, queen takes e1, we go rook d1, attacking the queen, attacking the rook. If he tries some shenanigans with queen to a2, trying to checkmate us on a1, well, we can take the rook and conveniently open up an escape square for the king. If he takes on h1, we can either take the rook, or we can go straight for the checkmate. With rook e8, anything is good. So after that, our opponent decided to go knight c6. Now we liquidate into an endgame where we are up a knight and two pawns. And here, finally, we signal that we know what the main plan is, which is to create a passed pawn. And in a separate video, I will certainly be talking about what the proper technique is in such positions. But I'm basically showing the essentials of it, which is to create that passed pawn and then use the king, knight, and rook to supervise it all the way to promotion, or force our opponent to trade rooks, which would, of course, be in our favor. We can create another passed pawn potentially on the other side of the board, as long as we can keep the knight protected. And so our opponent decided to resign. A very, very good game here by my opponent. I appreciate the chance to play him. I think this was a very instructive game. What are the key takeaways? Number one, do not dismiss openings like the modern. They are legit, and they're just a different way of looking at the game. But if you're a beginner, I would not recommend starting with this. I would recommend first learning how to play by occupying the center, and then only when you've mastered that, sort of branching out to these openings like the modern or the perk, or actually the Scandi is not one of those openings, but the perk is one d6, same kind of idea. It's actually the sister opening to the modern. It often transposes. Okay, so my bad, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so here we develop our pieces with the knight toward the center. Other takeaways from the game, obviously the concept of not rushing, right? At many points, there was a move that was very tempting, but we didn't make it because we thought a little bit deeper. And the same goes for observations. There were many moments when it seemed like the situation was in our opponent's favor. He was winning a piece, but we constantly question our assumptions. And this philosophy of questioning the assumptions you make, also, by the way, in regards to castling long, even though we had pushed a pawn out to a4, not a big deal as it turned out. You want to continually do that, and that helps you grow as a chess player. It helps you grow as a thinker, and it helps you develop more robust ways of looking at chess. So with all that being said, that was a lot. That was a very interesting game, and I think that's more than enough for one video, so I'll wrap up here. This was certainly a very, very combative game against a good opponent, so I will try my best to answer the questions in the comments, and I'm sure that people will have a lot. So I hope you folks enjoyed this next installment in Grandmaster Plays beginner/intermediate player. And I will certainly be making more as I go along, and be on the lookout for more speedrun videos, of course, coming out on the daily. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon in the next video. Bye.